Let's talk investment. Car meditation. This morning, a little after 6 a.m., I went to the gas station. And as I was leaving the gas station, this guy rolled down the window. He said, "Hey man, can I talk to you for a minute?" And I said, "Well, brother, I'm not walking over to a car. So I said, if you want, we can step in the gas station and talk." So he said, okay. So him and his wife came in the gas station, and he said, me and my wife wanna work out. He's like, "You look like you work out." And I said, "Oh yeah." I said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "That's actually my profession." And he said, "Yeah, man, we want to work." I said, "Are you guys like actively working out now, or have you started, or?" He said, "No." And I said, let me just say this. And I said, I don't want to be rude. I'm not meaning to be rude. But I said, I love seeing my people beautiful. I said, you got your Range Rover that look like it's a 2026. I said, you got your fly gear on. You and your wife look beautiful. I said, I love seeing my people beautiful, man. I said, I love seeing anybody, beautiful. And I said, but it's 2026, man. I said, we got to start investing in ourselves and what's really valuable in our life, man. I said, it's beautiful that you got all these things, man, but I said, people leaving here, and they leaving all this stuff here, man. And I said, we still missing the point of that lesson that, what's important is what's important, and what's not is what's not. And I was like, once upon a time in life, before somebody slapped a label on something and made their name valuable, I said, this stuff didn't matter. Things mattered. Other things mattered. Kindness, investing in yourself and youth and people and community. And, I said, other things mattered. And I said, because in reality, I said, how old are you two? And he said, well, I'm 57 and, my wife's 55. I said, man, the lady who owned Harold's just died. That's the other day, 55 years old. I'm like, 55 is young. I said, people are leaving here, man. I said, because of neglect. And I said, and bad investment. And I said, and I'm not saying that was her case, but I said, that's what's happening, man. And I said, and I can tell you just from what I've been doing for the last 20-some years, I said, you're going to have hip problems later because of your stomach. And I said, one day you're going to have to struggle to get up because of the weight you're carrying in the front. And I said, and when it comes time to put into action to protect this woman standing next to you, are you going to be able to do it? And I said, everybody can have a gun, but it don't matter if you can't get to it and use it. And I said, everybody can, learn this tactic and that tactic, but if you can't move, or it's going to take you a minute to get up, or it's going to hurt, or you're going to have lower back problems, knee issues. I was like, those things, man, you don't have to have. Some things are going to happen over wear and tear and time, but for the most part, if you invest in the right things, as time goes on, you'll be good. I said, my mom just turned 70, and I said, my mom has her own workout routine. And I said, yeah, she may not be throwing down that, with 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, but I said, my mom has a routine that her friends struggle to keep up with her sometimes, and she keeps building on herself at 70 years old. And I said, because she doesn't want to get old, and I said, so if you're serious, I said, I will gladly give you my contact information. But I said, if you're not going to be committed, if you're going to sacrifice everything just to cover everything up and look good and not care about what's really important, I said, bro, I'm in a space right now where I'm really trying not to waste no time. I said, I'm trying to cherish life and fight for my life. I said, my hand says, fight for your life. I said, man, it's deeper than people will ever know. And I said, so if you guys are serious, and his wife said, get his number. And I said, and he said, wow, brother. He said, if I ever thought about entertaining, quitting, or calling you and then flaking, he said, I won't now. Exchange information. Invest in yourself There's nothing wrong with that. Invest in yourself. You have to be here. Invest in yourself. You're investing in shoes and bags and coats and stuff that can burn up. And if something happens to this stuff, you can get it again. You can take a sledgehammer to your car, smash it to pieces, and I'm sure you'll find another way to get another vehicle. These things don't matter. These things don't matter. They matter only to the people that value them and make them matter. I don't want to see people dying at 55 and 56 and 57. God call you home, that's one thing, but not because you neglected to invest in the right things. Fight for your life.